the Buddha's path to the purification of the mind, the Buddha taught two different forms of meditation. The first form of meditation is what we call samatha meditation, which is meditation to develop concentration of mind, or to speak quite plainly, power of mind. In samatha meditation, concentration meditation, one chooses a single object, that is a single wholesome object, something that is going to lead to stillness. And the Buddha taught 40 different meditation objects, and one of those was meditation on the breath, which we began with. So one takes a soothing, calming object, such as the breath, and one focuses one's full and complete awareness and consciousness on the in-breath and the out-breath. Whenever discursive thinking arises, then one comes back to the breath, because the aim of concentration meditation is to cut off discursive thinking. One is aiming to just stay and think on the breath. One doesn't think about the breath, but one stays with full attention up with the breath. And by staying with the breath, watching the breath go in and out, there will be a sense of ease arising in the mind. There will be a sense of joy arising in the mind. And from that sense of ease and joy arising in the mind, it will lead to one-pointedness of mind. And this progressively increases till one reaches a point of pure equanimity in samatha meditation. Then there are various other ways of developing calm. For example, meditation on void, meditation on emptiness, meditation on infinite consciousness, meditation on neither perception nor non-perception. But the aim of these forms of meditation are to produce a concentrated, powerful, rested, still, calm and serene mind. This is the first form of meditation the Buddha taught. Now, this concentration meditation is not unique to Buddhism. It can be found in many other traditions. And its purpose is, as I said before, to cut off discursive thinking, because discursive thinking leads to weakness of mind. It also leads to unhappiness of mind. The reason that we are unhappy or diseased or unsatisfied or discontent is because we allow our mind to think without any control over where our mind goes. So with concentration meditation, what we're doing is controlling the mind to think on one object, to know completely just one object. Therefore, it cuts off discursive thinking and leads to happiness. And the Buddha said there is no greater happiness in the world than a peaceful, concentrated mind. But for many meditators, once their mind becomes a little concentrated, there's a sense of ease, a sense of peace, then often the question arises, where do I go to from there? What do I do next? And this is a very important question, because this actually happened with the Buddha himself when he first started practicing. Once he left the palace and became an ascetic, a samana. He started wandering and he developed concentration meditation, where he was able to make his mind very, very peaceful, very calm to the highest levels for long periods of time. But then, because concentration meditation is a conditioned thing, eventually one has to withdraw from that state. One cannot maintain the mind focused on one point continually. The faculty of mind and its function is to think. Now we can stop that thinking temporarily, but never permanently, except in death, of course. And so the Buddha found a sense of dissatisfaction with concentration meditation. He saw that it brought a lot of peace in the mind, happiness in the mind, and it brought a lot of power and strength to the mind, but that state in itself was temporary. He had to withdraw from that state. And just as ourselves sitting here, we may have experienced various degrees of peace and calm, but eventually we have to withdraw from that. So the Buddha said to himself that this path was unsatisfactory because it didn't lead to ultimate peace, where there is a complete stilling, a complete calming. And so he started another way of investigation. And he was searching for peace. But the way he searched for peace was to actually investigate being. And once he started to investigate being, what do I take to be myself? Then, by investigating that, he eventually reached enlightenment, and he saw clearly not what his self was, but what his self wasn't. And this is the second form of meditation that is taught in Buddhism, which is very unique to Buddhism, and we call it vipassana meditation or insight meditation. Now, the aim of insight meditation is to develop understanding, to completely know the present moment as it really is. And we're developing this full comprehension, this wisdom of knowing the present moment without any judging, without any preconditioning, without any assumptions about the present moment. Just to fully know completely things as they are. And this fully knowing things as they are is this process of insight meditation, to see things insightfully, to see things clearly, to comprehend things as they are fully. And in this form of meditation, one has to investigate what we take as self. Because our problem in existence is the idea of self. It's very interesting that the Buddha didn't start investigating who am I, but he started investigating what do I take as being? What do I take as self? So the Buddhist spiritual path is not a search for some ultimate being, some greater self, or something outside. It is actually looking in the here and now. What do I take in the here and now, this very present moment, to be self? And to know that. You cannot know something else beyond that. You can know the present moment. So what one is going to look at in this insight meditation and understand is, what does one take to be self? And this is a very important question. What do we attach to as being me and mine? And there is 5 things that the Buddha realized were the base of all attachment of a self, of a being. And he realized also that these 5 things as a base of attachment to being are the cause of all our problems. And the first one of those is when we ask ourselves, what do I take as being, what do I take as me? Then obviously the first thing that comes up is body, this physical form. One associates this physical form with self. This is my body. The next thing that we associate with being is feeling. Those pleasant bodily feelings and unpleasant bodily feelings which arise. For example, the pain in the knees, the pain in the back, or the pleasant physical feeling when one's feeling physically very good. One takes that feeling to be my feeling. I am feeling this. Then there is pleasant and unpleasant mental feeling, moods and emotions. One feels good. One's in a good mood. One is happy. Or one is depressed and sad. These pleasant and unpleasant mental feelings one associates as my feelings, as self. And then there are also another category of feelings that the Buddha pointed out, which were purely neutral feelings, neutral body feelings, which are, say, the feeling of your clothes on your body. It's mainly a neutral feeling. You don't notice it until the clothes become too tight or uncomfortable. Or sometimes if you touch the clothes, you realize it's a very pleasant sensation. Then you notice it. But most of the time it's neutral. And neutral mental feelings, when one is just has no liking or disliking. One stays in the middle. These 6 forms of feeling are what one associates as mind, self. Now there is another category of things that we associate with self, and that is perception, isn't it? When we see something visually, we see that as my sight. I am looking, I am seeing. When we hear, I heard this, I am listening. When we taste, when we smell, when we touch, and also when we think. In Buddhism there are 6 perceptions, the 5 bodily perceptions, and also the mental perception, because the mind is an organ which perceives thought. And so when we think, the old adage, I think, therefore I am, we associate thought as mine. I'll go on to comment on that I think, therefore I am later on. But that's what we associate with self. Perception. We perceive, we see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, and we think. Then there is another category of the concept of I, which is the conceptualization, ability to recall and remember. This is another idea of self. And then the last category of things that we take to self is consciousness, the knowing factor. And in consciousness, what one can know is the 6 sense bases. One sees, hears, smells, tastes and touch, but one can know that. In consciousness, in Buddhism, the Buddha described consciousness as with an eye organ. When that eye organ looks, say, at this microphone, because there is a physical object, and because of the reflection of light which enters an operating eye organ, if I was blind I wouldn't be able to see, obviously, so there has to be the organ operating. There has to be contact with the object, one has to look at it, and then when there's the contact between the two, there is a recognition through perception in the mind, and one consciously knows this object. So that's what we call consciousness in Buddhism. And it is the same with sound. If a sound arises, there's an operating ear organ, there's contact between the two, one knows sound through that perception of the sound. And it is same through all the other sense organs and the mind. One can know thought. Now, there's nothing else outside of these 5 things that can be taken for self. There is body, physical form, feeling, perception, mental formations or thought, and consciousness. This is what we call or associate with being. Now this is actually very important, because if one wants to develop meditation, one has to know what one's got to meditate on. If one is interested in actually understanding being, self, or the idea of self, the concept of self, the attachment to self, then one has to know where to investigate. Because the Buddhist path is a path of knowledge, it is a path of understanding. So I'm not asking you to believe that you take these 5 things to be self, but actually when you sit meditation or you're listening to this talk, actually to contemplate, to investigate. This is one of the ways of meditation, which leads to insight, to see things the way they are, with wisdom and understanding. The first thing, if we look at this body, the nature of the body, what do we take as self within the body? And one of the interesting things is that we see that our body actually is changing. And this is a very important clue to the conception of self, is if something is self, then it cannot change, can it? It has to be permanent. If I am looking for a self, a being, an ultimate reality, then it has to be something permanent and stable and secure that I can relate to and know. It cannot be something that is in a constant state of change. If something is in a constant state of change, then it cannot be taken as self. It cannot be taken as I am that, because that is changing. So what one was, one becomes not in a future time. And we see with our body, the Buddha is asking us in investigation meditation, insight meditation, to actually look at the body. Is this body that we have now the same as we were the day we were born? And is this body that we have now the same the day we die? Is this body that we have when we came into this room the same as when we go out of this room? And actually, if one actually starts to refine the contemplation, refine one's investigation, and to contemplate, one actually starts to see, understand that this body has changed, hasn't it? If you take a photograph of the day you were born, compare it to what you are now, then this body has changed. It has grown, it has matured, it has changed. The physical features are completely changed. And biologically, the body cells change every 7 years. So the body that you had 7 years ago is not the same that you have now. And nor will it be the same in 7 years' time, except for the brain cells, because the brain cells are just deteriorating. They're always dying. So it's not a very happy prospect anyway. So if you take, I am this physical form, then your physical form is completely different to 7 years ago, and will be completely different in 7 years' time. And as you sit here and now, it is changing. Isn't it? There's an interaction, there's chemical processes going on. Just as the breath goes in, the oxygen goes in, it goes through the blood, it is used in the body. There's a process going on all the time, just as we sit here. And every second that goes past, this body is aging. So one thing you can say is that when you came into this room, you had a younger body than when you go out of this room. Sorry about that, but it's the truth. So we can actually see by investigation, by contemplation, that this physical organ, this body, is changing. Now, if I am going to assume that I am the body, then as the body changes, and it changes in a direction that I don't like, for example, it gets old, gets wrinkly, gets sick, and then eventually it will die. So if I am saying, I am the body, this body is me and mine, then there's going to be dissatisfaction with the body when it grows old, when it gets sick, and when it dies. So we start to investigate and look at the body. Are you really this physical form? If you are, what part of the physical form do you take? And actually it's very interesting to contemplate this in the terms of on the atomic level. Are you the skin? If you're the skin, what's the difference between the air and the skin? On the atomic level, it's just an interaction, isn't it, of atoms? And the Buddha actually suggested investigating the body in terms of the elements that make up the body. The earth element, the hard aspects of the body, the bones, which come from earth. The liquid elements of the body, the fire elements, the heating element of the body, which keeps us warm. And the air element, emotions of the body. To actually investigate those. Which one of those are you, if you take the body to be self? So the Buddha actually always didn't say, this body is mine, but he always asked the question, am I really this body? And that's a very, very powerful question, actually. The Buddha was not saying, I am. He's saying, what am I? What do I take to be self? And if one wants to develop clear comprehension about life, then one actually has to know, what do I take as being, as self, as life? So start to actually clearly look, do I take body as being? If you do, then at death, when the body dies, then do you die? Do you cease to be? For materialist people, then they say, yes, the body ceases to be, because they cannot consciously know the body. Then what about in sleep? When you're not consciously aware of the body, do you cease to be? Or in a state of meditation, when you're not aware of the body, do you cease to be? So one is actually looking at what one takes to be self. And if one takes the body to be self, then that idea of self is constantly changing as the body constantly changes. And the next thing the Buddha asked to investigate, and this is something you can do when you're sitting in meditation, is to also look at feeling. When painful feeling arises, and one takes, this is my feeling, then the concept of self implies permanency, not impermanency. The concept of self implies happiness, not dissatisfaction. And the concept of self also implies control. One must be able to control, be in power. So one actually looks at feeling. When feeling arises, one looks at the characteristic of this feeling. Is this feeling permanent, or will it change? So one stays with this knowing quality, this knowing, feeling arising, and looking at its characteristics. Is this permanent or impermanent? And one will notice that feeling changes. Even painful feeling after a while changes. It pulsates. And then after a while will change to another form of feeling. If we move, it changes completely. Even if we sit there, it will change. So if we are really feeling, then we are changing. But what is changing cannot be called an ultimate self, because it implies inconsistency if it is changing. And one cannot be inconsistent in the idea of self. There has to be permanency. And the same with pleasant feeling. We notice pleasant mental feelings, joy, happiness and peace is quite changeable, quite fleeting. It comes and goes. So do you take feeling as self? If you do, then there's going to be dissatisfaction when that feeling changes. Or one gets a feeling that one doesn't want. If one really is feeling, then one could be able to control by saying, let me only experience happy feeling. But actually, if we sit and just know, then we are aware that we're feeling all forms of feeling, both pleasurable and unpleasurable. They arise and they cease. Therefore, one cannot say, just let me experience this form of feeling. Feeling just arises and passes away, according to a natural law, a natural phenomenon. Just arises and ceases. Therefore, one cannot control feeling. And the same with perception. This is another thing that we take to be self. We can say, let me only see beautiful things. But do we only see beautiful things? No, we don't. We see those things that we don't want to see, we don't like. Or let me only hear pleasant sound. Or let me not hear any sound. If you sat still and just listen, then you hear sound arising and ceasing. Arising and ceasing. It comes and goes. One cannot just determine not to hear sound. If one has the ear organ and sound arises, there's contact between the two, then there's conscious awareness of that sound. And so we can see that actually perception cannot be controlled. There is the arising of perception, and there's the cessation of perception. So in Vipassana meditation, one is looking at perception. When a sound arises, what's the reaction to that sound? Usually there's two reactions. There's either pleasure or displeasure. If it's a pleasant sound, one wants to hear it, then pleasure arises. There's a feeling arises in the mind. When there's displeasure, there's aversion arising in the mind. And that leads to attachment. One doesn't want to hear that sound anymore, or one does want to hear that sound. So therefore, dissatisfaction arises because of sound. With the other factors of the perception quality, the sense organs that allow perception to arise, the same thing happens. They arise and cease. Smell arises and ceases. Taste arises and ceases. Feeling arises and ceases. And then mental thoughts arise and cease. What is arising and ceasing is that worthy of calling self? Now this is a question one actually has to ask in Vipassana meditation. This thing that is arising and ceasing, is that worthy of calling self? Can I be found in that which arises and ceases? Because now it is and now it's gone. Can I be found in what is gone? No, obviously. And also the quality of thought. For any of you who have sat meditation, you will notice that it is very difficult to control thought. One is bombarded with many different thoughts. Some are good, some are not so good. Some are pleasant, some are not. Some are high-minded, some are base. So we see that there is the impingement of thought on the mind when we just stop, be still, and know. We see this continual train of thinking which is arising and ceasing. Sometimes pleasant thoughts arise, sometimes unpleasant thoughts arise. Sometimes thoughts of happiness arise, sometimes thoughts of aversion, anxiety, fear, worry, doubt, confusion, depression arise. But what we can know about thought is that it arises and then passes away. So if it arises and passes away, is it your thought? Or is it just thinking? One can just know the characteristic of thought. So in insight meditation, we're not judging thought, that this is a good thought and that is a bad thought. We're just knowing thinking. Thought arising and thought ceasing. So we're knowing the characteristic of it. Does it change? Or is it permanent? Is it me? Is it mine? Can I take it to be self? And there's one thing that you can certainly see with thought, that it is extremely changeable. The Buddha actually said there's nothing faster than thought. And our minds can be happy one second and depressed the next. We can go through a whole array of thoughts in a very short time. We can be inspired or we can not be inspired. We can be delighted or not delighted. We have many, many different thoughts arising and passing away in this present moment. So what we're doing in insight meditation is knowing what is the characteristic of thought. Is it permanent or is it impermanent? Is it satisfying or is it unsatisfying? what is impermanent and unsatisfying can never be taken as an ultimate self. The next factor that one is looking at in insight meditation is the aspect of consciousness. This is a very refined aspect. This is the aspect of knowing. Consciousness means to know, to comprehend, to cognize. And as I explained before, consciousness operates only in terms of the 6 sense doors. That one has to have an object, for example, a physical object, or a sound, or a taste, or an odor, or a physical contact, a feel, a tactile object, or a mental object, a thought to arise, before one can know that. And we see that all these things, these 6 sense bases, are constantly changing. There is a constant movement, a constant flux. And this quality of change is what we call anicca in Buddhism, impermanency, this constant flux. And so if one develops meditation, one will be able to see that one can only know one thing at one time. You cannot feel and think at the same time. What you feel, you may think about, but those qualities are actually separated in time. And that's a very, very important concept to understand, that there is only one thing arising and passing away at any one time in the present moment. And that one thing you can know. What is it? But because the mind works so quickly, for a person who has never developed concentration and stillness of mind, then they cannot separate the mental, psychological factors out. They just see them as a mass. So what happens is what we feel or what we perceive, we feel about. For example, I perceive what I say, this is blue carpet. Then a feeling arises, either pleasant or unpleasant. If I like it through my conditioning, I like blue. There's a pleasant feeling arises. It's a nice blue carpet. With that feeling, obviously there's perception. I have to perceive that blue carpet. And there's consciousness operating there, because that blue carpet has arisen in my consciousness. I have known that quality, that colour, the feeling associated with the colour, and the perception. So there are these of these 5 factors that we call being, or associate with being, we mistakenly associate with being. They can be broken up into 2 factors, the physical, the body, and outer forms, and the mental psychological qualities, which are feeling, perception, thoughts, and consciousness. Now these last 4, the feeling, perception, thought, and consciousness, are very, very closely interrelated. And as I said, what we perceive, we think about, what we think about, we feel about, we have a feeling, emotional reaction to, and there is a conscious awareness of them. But these 4 factors actually operate separately in time. So that is why this insight meditation is actually a quality of knowing what is happening in the present moment, and knowing it according to these 5 factors of being. And then one investigates and knows, does that change or not change? Then if one knows that it changes, then one investigates, can that be called a permanent self? Now, obviously, this is a very refined, very technical form of meditation. And that is why the Buddha actually taught samatha meditation, concentration meditation first. That is, that we come, we sit, we still our minds by watching a pacifying object, for example, a breath, bringing joy and happiness into the mind, directing the mind onto the breath, making the mind peaceful, making the mind tranquil, making the mind calm, and then making the mind still. Then when the mind is still and calm, that's not enough from the point of view of Buddhist meditation. One withdraws from that still and calm state and applies the mind to the work of investigation, to the work of insight. And that's why it's called gammatana in Pali, which means the work of the mind, the base that one has to work on. And what does one work on? One has to work on, what do I take as self? That's what one needs to know to understand truth. The Buddha actually said that the world is just within this body and mind. If you know this body and mind, the physical and the psychological processes, then you know the world. And you know the ending of the world. And you know the beginning of the world. Because it is just an interaction of these 5 aggregates that I've spoken about, these 5 khandhas in Pali, these qualities that we take to be self. And the Buddha said that anything that you take to be self has to be found in these 5 things. Now what happens is the reason that we take them to be self is because we don't understand clearly enough, with enough precision of mind, to see the changing nature of them. But when we stop, make the mind still and clear, and we see the actual changing flux of these 5 things that arise and cease, arise and cease, arise and cease. When you see the impingement of these 5 things, then we can understand the idea of impermanency. That this thing that we took to be self is actually an impermanent thing. And the only thing that gives it a sense of consistency is memory. The memory and that association. For example, the feeling that I had 2 seconds ago has completely ceased, because it is actually pulsating. There can only be one thing arising in the present moment. It arises and then ceases. The thing that links them, that makes me think this is my feeling, is the memory of that past feeling and the association with, the present feeling that might be arising. Then if there is a break in feeling, for example, as I'm speaking, I'm having to cognize a thought of what I'm going to say, then there is a break with the feeling. But then I go back through memory to say, oh, that feeling which passed away was my feeling. So I am giving importance to that feeling as being me and mine. But what we're doing with insight meditation is saying, do I take that feeling as self? And if the feeling ceases, then that cannot be a permanent self, because self has ceased. If I think, therefore I am, then when thinking ceases, then I cease to exist, which is absurd. Because You can even experience non-thought here and now. For example, by stopping the mind, by thinking. It's not thinking. For example, if you purposely think a thought, for example, blue, then after you've said that to yourself, then you'll notice there's actually a space before the word in the mind and after the word in the mind. And that space is non-thought. When you concentrate the mind and go into a very still state of mind, all thought ceases. So if one takes the concept that I think, therefore I am a being, therefore I am thinking, then when you go into concentration, then you cease to exist. And when you go into sleep, then you cease to exist. So what one sees is not that one is thought, but thought is changing. And the Buddha asked, what is changing? Is that satisfactory or unsatisfactory? If something is constantly changing, then it is unsatisfying, because we're looking for something that is permanent. And if something is unsatisfying, is that worthy of calling self? That's a very interesting way the Buddha actually phrased that. What is impermanent, is that satisfactory? Obviously not. And what is unsatisfactory, is that worthy of being called self? So if your body is constantly changing, which it is, but usually we're not aware of it, we don't know it as it really is in the present moment, but it is changing constantly, then the body, if we take it to be self, is unsatisfactory as a self, because it must die and it is changing. What is unsatisfactory as a self, then that is not worthy of being called self. So we're not saying, I am not this body, we're just trying to see what do we take as self. And then looking, is that a true, permanent, unchanging thing that one can call self? If it is not, then one has to reject that as self. And the same with feeling, the same with perception, the same with thought, and the same with consciousness. So one sees that actually the Buddha, when he was on his spiritual path, he wasn't trying to say, I am this, or I am that, I am an ultimate being, I am an ultimate soul, I am a consciousness or a supreme consciousness. What he was saying was actually quite basic and to the point actually. He was saying, what do I take to be self in this present moment? Body? If it's body, does that change? Yes. Then that's unsatisfactory. What is unsatisfactory? Is that worthy of calling self? No. That's not worthy of calling self. Feeling. This is my feeling. Am I taking feeling to be self? Does feeling change then? Yes, it does. What changes? Is that worthy of calling self? No, it's not worthy of calling self because it's unsatisfactory. The same with perception. That is in a constant state of flux. What is in a constant state of flux? Is that satisfying or unsatisfying? It's unsatisfactory because it must cease, it must die. What must cease and must die does not lead to happiness. Therefore, that is not worthy of being called self. And the same with thought. He saw thought arising and ceasing. Therefore, he said, thought is not worthy of being called self because it changes constantly. One can find no permanency in thought. And the same with consciousness. So what happened as he was meditating, his mind turned away. And the mind being the factor of clear comprehension, understanding, wisdom turned away from what is not self. And this is a very, very important thing to understand, because if one doesn't understand these 5 things that one takes to be self falsely, then one will not know the path to liberation according to the Buddhist tradition. And the path to liberation according to the Buddhist tradition is not a belief in some self or ultimate being. It is an understanding of the present moment, here and now. What do I take as self? What is being attached to as being mine in the present moment? And looking at the characteristics of that, comprehending them clearly, and if one sees that it changes, is unsatisfying, then one rejects that as not being self. So actually this is what we mean by really searching for truth. One can only search for truth from what one knows and can comprehend. One cannot search for the unknown. One can only know the present moment. And knowing the present moment is what we call insight meditation. And this is a very, very important form of meditation because it does lead to liberation, it does lead to enlightenment. And enlightenment means that which is free from the concept of self. We have rejected everything that is false, everything that changes, and gone to what doesn't change. There is the movement to what doesn't change, the experience of what doesn't change, and that's what we call nibbana, enlightenment, the unconditioned. It is not conditioned by impermanency, it is not conditioned by dissatisfaction, it is not that thing that is constantly in a state of flux. It is the unchanging. And because it is unchanging, it is the deathless, the amata Dhamma. So that is what the mind is moving towards. So I would recommend all of you who are practicing meditation, when the mind goes to a state of calm and peace, then one actually has to apply that calm and peaceful state of mind to the work of investigation. And what one investigates is these 5 things: body, feeling, perception, thought, and consciousness. Because that is the world. And if one wants to know the path to liberation, it can only be found in this investigation of these 5 things. So that this is the work that has to be done. And that is very, very important, because a lot of people, when they practice meditation, they may experience a state of calm, but then they ask themselves, what do I do next? Where do I go from here? And Buddhist meditation is not just stopping at states of peace. Because if that peace is impermanent, then it is not ultimate peace. The aim of the Buddha was to experience ultimate peace, to seek ultimate peace. And ultimate peace can only be obtained from being free from that which changes, from that which is unsatisfactory, and from that which is not worthy of being self. And that can only be known with wisdom in the present moment. To know what is arising, ceasing in the present moment is the path to liberation. So I'll end that talk this evening on the 5 khandhas. Excuse me for new people who may have just come, that talk might have been fairly technical, but it is very important, because there's many people here who have been practicing meditation for a long time, over many years, and it's very important to understand what is involved in meditation, what are the techniques, what are the tools that we use, because Buddhism is very straightforward, it's very rational, it's very logical. What we're trying to do is develop understanding and comprehension, and applying that in our daily lives and seeing whether it works. Is that true? We're not trying to believe. We're not saying, yes, the Buddha said it's all not self, therefore I believe it's all not self, but still carry on as if it is all self. I'm saying, well, is it true what the Buddha said? What do I take as self? And then looking at that. And does it change? Yes. Okay, body changes. If I take myself to the body when I die, then I'm going to suffer. So if one's going to suffer, then that's not worthy of calling self. So one lets go of that. When I was in the car coming to the society tonight, we saw a sticker on the back of the car in front of us, on the back windscreen, that said, home is the place where birth is. The real home is the place where birth is. A bit of a strange sticker. But it seemed it actually stimulated the idea, well, if real home is the place where birth is, then what does birth lead to? And this is very interesting, because this is exactly what the Buddha asked himself. He said, I am born, then what does birth lead to? And this is what we call contemplation. Contemplation, investigating life. What birth leads to is eventually maturing, then old age, then sickness, and then death. So the Buddha asked himself, well, actually birth is unsatisfactory, because it leads to aging and death. And aging and death is not something he wanted. So he actually saw that the problem of life was actually with birth, not with death. And our meditation teacher, Ajahn Chah, whose photograph is on the shrine here, he used to say that actually, that like people cry at funerals, and when a baby is born they're delighted and they're happy. He said they've got it completely around the wrong way. When a baby is born they should all cry, and then at funerals they should be happy. Because with birth, that is a causal condition for aging and death to occur. So the problem, and it is just a natural process, naturally leads there. So the problem is one has to question that. Okay, what is the problem? If one doesn't want death, then logically one has to seek non-birth. And it's same with all our experiences. If one wants pleasant experience and that ceases, then one has to seek non-experience, the non-becoming of something. And we notice that when we go into, say, peaceful states of mind, when there's no thought arising, that is actually peaceful. Because peace means non-disturbance, non-agitation. So to actually have no disturbance is pure peace. And so actually the Buddha was seeking for a path that didn't involve birth or becoming, and therefore death as well. So he started to look back what causes birth and becoming, and he saw it was attachment to body, wanting a body, desiring a body, desiring feeling, desiring perception, desiring thought, and desiring consciousness. So he saw that attachment and that desire to those 5 things was the cause for becoming, therefore old age, sickness and death. And so he investigated those and was liberated from those forms of becoming by liberating himself from the attachment, by letting go of the attachment to those 5 things. Is there any questions on what I've said tonight? Please feel free to ask. Yes. It's a form of what the Buddha called bhava tanha. Bhava tanha means the craving to be, to become, to create or make. So, for example, we build a house, and because of that desire to build, one is motivated by a desire to have a house, to build it. And then in that becoming, building and creating, then one attaches, this is mine. So the association of that object to being mine and ownership over. So one actually doesn't contemplate that eventually that house, one has to be separated from that house, even temporarily. For example, if you come here, you're separated from that house. So one actually doesn't have ultimate control over that house, for example. Someone else can, say, break in or whatever. One doesn't have ultimate control over the house. And eventually one has to be separated from that house in the ultimate sense. One dies from it. So what we're doing in Buddhism is actually investigating the changing qualities or the characteristics of something. But that doesn't mean that actually the Buddha negated the intention to do something. Because obviously there are skillful desires and unskillful ones, or desires that lead to greater attachment and suffering, and desires that lead to the ending of attachment and suffering. And that's actually a very, very important point, because the Buddha actually gave a very beautiful discourse saying one should use desire to overcome desire. One should use anger to overcome anger. One should use conceit to overcome conceit. And he gave various similes along that line. And for example, using desire to overcome the desire is one actually has to have the desire and motivation to do something good, or else one won't do it. And the Buddha actually used a different word for desires which are wholesome or skillful, which lead to the ending of desire, and he called it chanda, or volition or will. For example, you have to actually desire to make your mind peaceful and desire to concentrate on the breath, to experience the freedom of a still mind which is free from desire. Yes? So one is using skillful desires to overcome unskillful desires. For example, one may have anger or hatred for somebody, but one knows that that's unskillful. I don't feel good. It doesn't lead to happiness in my life. It doesn't lead to pleasure. It makes society, the society that I'm involved in, uncomfortable. Leads to conflict. So then one has the desire to remove that anger. So one is motivated to do something to overcome that. So one is using skillful desires to overcome unskillful desires. Because the Buddhist path is a progressive path. There's a very beautiful... Actually, I've got the quote here. I'll read it out to you. Just happen to have it handy. This is what I was going to talk on about originally, actually. But This is on the gradual path, and the Buddha said, just as the mighty ocean deepens and slopes gradually down, sloping and inclining, not plunging by a sudden drop, even so, in this Dhamma teaching, the training is gradual, progress is gradual, proceeding step by step. There is no sudden penetration to enlightenment. And that's very important, because I think a lot of people think, well, I'll come along and sit at the Buddhist Society for a couple of weeks and I'll become enlightened and then go and have a good time. That's what I thought. Look what happened to me. We see that actually it is a progressive path. So what we have to do is actually accept where we're at. We have desire. But what we're trying to do is, it's a path of purification. We're trying to purify the coarse desires out, those desires that are motivated by selfishness, motivated by greed, motivated by anger, motivated by delusion and confusion. We're purifying those out and replacing them with more wholesome desires. The desire to be generous, the desire to be kind, the desire to be loving, the desire to be peaceful, the desire to be knowledgeable about truth. So what we're using is we're purifying our body, speech and mind from those expressions of the coarser desires that are motivated by selfishness and an idea of self and small-mindedness, and making the mind lift up and ennobling the mind, making it rise to wholesome desires, more skillful desires. And the ultimate wholesome desire is the desire for nibbana, enlightenment, because that frees one from all desire. So one actually has to go up the ladder step by step, as the Buddha said. You don't suddenly jump from the ground to the top. You've got to go progressively. And that's very important to remember. For example, one uses anger to overcome anger. So one uses aversion to anger to overcome anger. And one sees oneself, I'm an angry person, I don't like anger. So one uses, I'm going to do something about this. So one is averse. When one gets angry, that's not good. So one turns that anger against itself. Right? And that's very skillful. Using the power of unwholesome things to turn against themselves to overcome them. And the example of conceit, overcoming conceit. You often see that, for example, when you're sitting meditation for the half an hour and you're sitting still and I say, don't move, and you're sitting still and you want to move, and then you see everyone else is not moving, and so you think, I can't move, it's too embarrassing if I move. He said, don't move, If I move, I'll embarrass myself and everybody will know and they'll hear. And so what you do is you sit still, right? I mean, that is coming from a sense of conceit, I am, right? But it's using that conceit of I am to overcome conceit. So one tries, I'm going to try and sit and try and still my mind. Everyone else can do it, why can't I? So one uses that against itself. And eventually, the strength of that builds a momentum where it actually one overcomes conceit in the ultimate sense. One breaks through the sense of self. So that is very, very important, because a lot of people who initially come to Buddhism, they hear that, the Buddha said that there is unsatisfactoriness in the world, the first noble truth. Second noble truth, that has a cause, which is caused by craving and desire. Then he said that there's liberation from craving and desire, which is nirvana, enlightenment. And then there is a path. So people think, there's dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction is caused by desires, therefore I should have no desires. And then, I shouldn't even desire to meditate. I shouldn't even desire to go to work. I just shouldn't desire to do anything. And that's how we perceive it. But that is like trying to be the ultimate, when one is still motivated by the base, and one can't. So one actually uses the process of gradual purification. And that's why the Buddha said it's a gradual path. There's no sudden enlightenment. But once one has gradually purified the mind, once the mind is totally purified, then there is sudden enlightenment. But only after the gradual path has been obtained. It's like if I fill this glass with water, gradually fill it up, then there'll get some point when it will suddenly spill over because of the gradual filling of water. Is there any other questions? I'll just end. Many of you know that Ajahn Brahmawangsa has been giving the talks, and tonight he has gone to do a meditation retreat. And so he asked myself to give the talk. We have Venerable Jatamalo, who's come to stay at our monastery now. There's 10 monks staying at the monastery. So we've decided to give Ajahn Brahmawangsa a break, because he was telling me the other night that he had a nightmare that he doesn't usually dream, but this one night he had a nightmare where he was walking down the streets of Perth, and there was a Vauxhall van driving after him, and there was all this people in this van, and they had the windows wind down, and they were hanging out the windows chasing him in his car, yelling out, "Teach me meditation, teach me meditation." And so he was running as fast as he could to get away from all these people, and they were driving after him saying, "Teach me meditation, teach me meditation." So he figured he needed a break. So
Thanks, Ajahn Nyanadhammo. I'm very fortunate that we have other monks that can give talks when one of them's being chased by people in a Vauxhall van. I do have a couple of messages, but first of all to welcome people who are, all of you who are here, but particularly those of you who are here for the first time. We hope you've enjoyed this evening, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, or you'd just like to meet some new people, or like to have a look around the centre, if you'd like to see me afterwards, I'll be on this side of the hall. I'd be happy to meet you and answer your questions. A couple of announcements. First of all is that some of you will be aware of the fact that Venerable Nyanadhammo will be here in July running a retreat, a 9-day retreat. Registration forms are now available and they're in the library. That retreat's being held from the 15th to the 24th of July, and is a terrific opportunity for those of us who can take the time out of our normal working schedules to really spend some time in our practice. Sunday week, that Sunday the 22nd, is Vaisakha Day. We normally call it Vaisak, which is a very important day on the Buddha's calendar. It's the day where we honour the birth, enlightenment and death of the Buddha, and it's a full day's program. And if you want to pick up a copy of the newsletter, if you haven't already got one, in the reception, you'll find inside the front cover is the program for the day. We start the day at 9 o'clock, and at 9:30 we can take either 5 or 8 precepts if we want to, and we share a meal at 10:30, and there's a Dhamma Talk following that. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon is an opportunity for people who are new Buddhist people who would like to take the 5 precepts and the 3 refuges for the first time, to join with other people at that time to do so. It's a really lovely thing to do, and particularly on Vaisak. And there's an afternoon program, and in the evening we finish the proceedings with a circumambulation, which is a very pleasant thing to do, which we do with candles and flowers, and it's a very nice thing to be part of. We hope that you can join in that day. I have been asked again to remind people if they could please not put their shoes near the door, either to the door to this room or to the house, as that it interferes with the people who need wheelchair access. So if you could keep your shoes right away from the door, and preferably at the benches at the back that are provided for them, it would be much appreciated. Just a little social event is that the Zen Buddhist group tomorrow night have a fundraising concert, which is being held at the Cafe Folkloric in View Street, North Perth. It's $10 for adults and $5 for children. If you'd like to attend that, the Zen Buddhist people will make you very welcome. Somebody suggested tonight that there's many people who come here who normally receive our newsletter in the mail who would probably prefer to pick it up here rather than have it mailed and sort of save the mailing costs that are incurred that way. We are currently putting our mailing list on our computer system, and it's an opportunity for us to make a note of that. So if you would like to pick your newsletter up here rather than have it mailed to you, if you would just write your name and address and put "please don't mail" on a piece of paper and either give it to me or leave it next to the telephone, we will see that you're not actually you don't receive it by mail and you can pick it up here. Hope you'll enjoy the rest of the evening and come across to the house for a cup of tea and meet a few people and socialise for a little while. Have a look in the library. If you've got any questions about the library, if you'd like to see me or the librarians, I'll tell you how it works. Thank you.